In 2010, science historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway published Merchant of Doubt, a book that exposed the extent of scientific disinformation aimed at denying the extent of climate change and its likely disastrous consequences on the security of human societies. As they showed, some institutes and experts in the field have deliberately biased their research to feed the controversy and favor the status quo. In their well-documented book, Oreskes and Conway draw striking parallels with other previously documented cases, such as scientific disinformation on smoking, acid rain, and the ozone layer depletion. In all of these cases, the scientific community was poisoned by malicious members who maintained doubt about the dangerousness of industrial products and normalized inaction despite this dangerousness. While a huge part of sciences is spared from such betrayals, especially the fundamental sciences that have few applications, the presence of enormous industrial and geopolitical stakes in certain sectors must absolutely call for vigilance. We must not lose sight of the fact that science is carried out by humans who can be put under pressure, especially under pressure to publish, or even be corrupted, or more simply be biased by the sometimes unhealthy influence of stars in their fields. Unfortunately, in my field of research, namely artificial intelligence and more particularly machine learning security, the industrial and geopolitical stakes are absolutely enormous, and starification is very widespread. After all, we are talking about companies that are even more powerful than the oil industry in terms of turnover alone. Added to this is the pressure to publish, with huge salaries for those who do succeed. This seems to me to have dangerously pushed a few of my peers, especially a few who work for or with private companies, to produce, disseminate and accept extremely dangerous scientific disinformation that justifies the hasty and massive deployment of algorithms without security guarantees, algorithms which have been hacked by disinformation campaigns for more than a decade, leading to the rise of authoritarianism around the world and even to genocide in Myanmar, Ethiopia or Ukraine. Even more disturbingly, the overwhelming majority of the scientific community seems to me to favor this terrifying status quo and to normalize, if not encourage, the inattention to this very disturbing scientific disinformation and to its disastrous social consequences on millions of human lives. Today, I am going to tell you about 4 scientific papers published in prestigious peer-reviewed conferences, which seems to me to be very clearly dangerous scientific disinformation. And to be clear, I am not claiming that the content of the papers is wrong, but rather that the presentation of the papers, especially the titles, abstracts, and introductions, these were written in a deliberate and dangerous misleading manner, in the vein of a publication that would report the cooling of a region on the planet, and whose title would be "The Whole Globe is Not Warming." Strangely, all of the most problematic papers I found are all published with at least one Google employee as an author, a company that has previously prevented its researchers from publishing scientific papers and has explicitly required them to strike a positive tone in their scientific publications. But above all these articles falsely claim to solve the security problems of machine learning, or at least they aim at denying these problems, just like all industries that try to deny the seriousness of climate change or claim that technical solutions will eventually be found. Moreover, we will see that this disinformation is so far terribly effective by devaluing certain lines of research on safety, or by producing disinformation that has unfortunately become very widespread in the scientific community. Yet, of course, the disinformation we are going to talk about is restricted to what I found, read, and took the time to debunk in my very limited time, and despite me having so many other priorities. In this video, I will also talk about the enormous scientific debunking work that my fantastic collaborators and I have done, as we wrote papers contradicting Google's disinformation claims and got these papers scientifically accepted in the most prestigious venues in machine learning, including NeurIPS and ICML. Even though our papers receive far less citations and attention from academics than the disinformation produced by Google. Repeatedly, we showed that machine learning is far less secure than what is commonly believed. If you are a computer science researcher, I urge you to demand a lot more rigor from yourself and from your colleagues, especially with respect to claims that security problems are solved or that they are not credible. The scientific publications of such claims will have major consequences for the algorithms deployed on a very large scale by Google and others, and they may then amplify already deeply worrying geopolitical tensions. I urge you to be particularly rigorous when doing scientific paper peer review, when selecting speakers to invite to your universities, and when choosing whom to recruit or promote. In addition to potentially validating and propagating scientific disinformation, a lack of vigilance can also and above all lead to more proliferation of opaque, insecure, and potentially very dangerous algorithms under the pretext that their principles have been validated by the scientific community. And if you are not a computer scientist, you can still help to alert the scientific community about its vulnerability to Google's scientific disinformation by massively sharing this video, in particular with computer scientists, but also by asking journalists and politicians to report on science disinformation in machine learning. Additionally, you can also participate in ethical research projects that aim to fix dangerous large-scale algorithms like the Tournesol project. I will come back at greater length to the possible actions at the end of the video. Now, the video is a bit long, so let me quickly give the outline. We'll first talk about disinformation around the protection of sensitive information by learning algorithms, before then talking about the security of these algorithms. And then, finally, there will be the conclusion. Each section is then subdivided into subsections whose timecodes are given in the description. Let's go. The simplest scientific disinformation to understand is that of the protection of sensitive information. Until now, regulations such as the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, have mostly focused on protecting users' personal data, with the underlying assumption that this would be enough to protect our societies from the public revelation of sensitive information. Except that the link between protection of personal data, for instance the data on your phone or in your Google account, and the protection of sensitive information indirectly extracted from the personal data is far more complex than meets the eye, especially when algorithms use personal data to answer queries of other web users. And note that this can happen with very basic algorithms. For instance, when WhatsApp tells you that a person you are talking to received your message, it is revealing information that this other person would potentially prefer not to reveal. Thereby, a sensitive information, i.e. information that someone would not want to be disclosed, this sensitive information is actually stored in another user's personal data. That said, the problem of algorithmic exploitation of personal data is of course far more important in the case of machine learning. After all, these learning algorithms are literally designed to learn from data. If that data contains sensitive information, then the algorithm will literally have learned this sensitive information. Yet, what's very problematic and dangerous is that the algorithm that may contain the sensitive information is generally not considered to be personal data, and GDPR is then very unclear about the rights and duties of this algorithm. Yet, if the algorithm has learned sensitive information, the actions subsequently taken by the algorithm can largely betray this sensitive information. For instance, merely looking at the recommendations made by YouTube's algorithm to a user exposes sensitive information about the user's viewing habits. More generally, any object obtained from personal data mining, including something as simple as a recommendation, is a potential leak of sensitive information. But there's even worse. Language algorithms are often designed to literally spit out what they have learned, with almost always very little, if any, distinction between public and sensitive information. By asking these algorithms to fill out semi-filled forms, researchers have shown that it is sometimes possible to retrieve personal information of real human individuals, while users of a commercialized computer language algorithm have shown that this algorithm exposes secret keys, in addition to spitting out licensed code. More worryingly, as language algorithms develop, we can expect that our phones will gradually have very sophisticated language algorithms to autocomplete our messages on our smart keyboards. But as a result, it could one day be possible to type "Zelensky told his wife last night that" and have Google Gboard read the autocompletion to extract potentially very sensitive information. The massive deployment of such algorithms would then be extremely dangerous. Now, faced with these obvious risks, Google had to tackle the security of these algorithms. So how did they go about this? Did they deal with the problem with seriousness, rigor, and transparency? Have they been up to the enormous social challenges at stake? In 2015, Google proposed a distributed learning algorithm, which they called Federated learning, that could learn from user data without ever having that data transferred to Google servers. Basically, instead of sending the data, each user's phone will use algorithms related to the famous neural networks to calculate what is called a model or gradient, and it is this computed object that is transferred to Google's servers. Google researchers then deployed their federated learning systems on the phone of millions of users to learn what those users are typing on their Gboard smart keyboards. I cannot stress enough how much incredibly sensitive information lies in such data. Think about it, there may be nothing more intimate than what you type on your phone's keyboard, especially on private messengers like Signal or WhatsApp. What's more, the information in that data may be as sensitive to the person you're talking to as it is to you. And it may even be sensitive to a third party if you're talking about them. And of course, all of this is done without the informed consent of the users, or at least the articles don't mention consent at all. I quote, "For this study, logs were collected from the English-speaking population of Gboard users in the United States." In fact, if you use Gboard by default, everything you type is most likely learned by a Google algorithm. I'll stress this again. Even if you are using a secure messaging application like Signal, before your messages are encrypted, you are typing them in clear on a keyboard that most likely learns from what you type. And given Gboard's lack of attention to security, a gaffe by this AI could one day leak your communications. If all of this is concerning to you, I invite you to consider using open source alternatives like OpenBoard or AnySoft keyboard. But be careful, there is no guarantee that the code executed on your phone is the one published on their GitHub. In fact, for ultra-sensitive stuffs, like say talking about abortion in the US, you probably want to totally disable the smart side of the keyboard and even to use a less vulnerable machine than the phone, like a laptop. And yet, this is not the most serious issue. What is extremely dangerous is that Google has managed to propagate the scientific disinformation that federated learning, which is so useful for the lucrative business of ad targeting, Google has managed to propagate the scientific disinformation that federated learning protects users' data. A quote from a Google blog post: "Federated learning allows for smarter models, lower latency, and less power consumption, all while ensuring privacy." All while ensuring privacy. What a disinformation. And this disinformation found its way into the published scientific literature, in particular in this paper published at CCS 2017 with the very misleading title, "Practical Secure Aggregation for Privacy-Preserving Machine Learning." In the abstract, this paper has the misleading claim, I quote, "We prove the security of our protocol in the honest but curious and active adversarial settings." To the machine learning researcher who is unfamiliar with the subject, or to the legislator who is skimming, this sentence gives the impression that federated learning guarantees the protection of sensitive information. This is, I think, the clearest and most successful scientific disinformation in machine learning today. And yet, this disinformation is trivial to debunk. Federated learning is simply a more sophisticated procedure to achieve the same result as classical centralized learning. Therefore, a federated learning algorithm will have learned the same thing as a centralized algorithm, even if homomorphic encryption or shared secrets are used in the middle, as is the case in the Google paper. Yet, over the last 5 years or so, a lot of theoretical and empirical research has consistently shown that modern learning algorithms achieve their best performances when they memorize the training data, a phenomenon called double descent. Therefore, federated learning is at its best, and who today in machine learning is not trying to optimize its learning, this federated learning will ultimately produce an algorithm that will contain all of the user's data. As a result, it could be possible for anyone to deconstruct this algorithm to recover sensitive information. Worse, if it is a language processing algorithm, it could be enough to simply ask questions to the algorithm for it to answer and reveal sensitive information. Now, the authors of the disinformation papers clearly realized this, but they only point it out in the heart of the paper, where they write, I quote, "When executing the protocol with threshold T, the joint view of the server and any set of less than T honest users does not leak any information about the other user's inputs besides what can be inferred from the output of the computation." This admission of weakness buried in the main text is actually huge. In particular, overall, federated learning, even with cryptographic tricks, actually offers no guarantee of protection of sensitive information. Unfortunately, however, lazy academics, journalists, and legislators who only read the title, the summary, and the introduction, as is the case for myself most of the time, they will not be able to realize it. Yet the consequences of a massive propagation of sensitive information through learning algorithms would be absolutely catastrophic. Imagine the social upheaval that would occur if anyone would suddenly spy on anyone else. The sudden revelation of many betrayals could exacerbate tensions and seriously increase the risks of armed violence. Moreover, business and state secrets could then be exploited by malicious entities. Even worse, passwords to critical systems, such as those that take control of medical data, nuclear power plants, and banking systems, or sensitive information about the humans in charge of the security of these information systems, all of this could be exploited by malicious actors. We are talking here about a national security issue and even a threat to world peace. So let me stress this again. Federated learning, even when combined with homomorphic encryption or shared secrets, offers no guarantee of protecting sensitive information. At best, it should be seen as a technical hack to do machine learning while complying to a weak and very clumsy version of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. At worst, it is a scientific disinformation that Google wanted the scientific community to scientifically validate with success in order to legitimize the massive deployment of surveillance technologies that will allow them for ever better targeted advertising. And yet, very disappointingly, the disinformation that federated learning protects sensitive information has been picked up, amplified, and normalized by far too many scientific publications. Google's very dangerous 2017 scientific paper has been cited nearly 1,600 times by other academic researchers' publications, according to Google Scholar. 1,600 citations in 5 years, this is absolutely huge. Even worse, if you search federated learning is a privacy in quotation mark in Google Scholar, you will realize that Google's scientific disinformation is repeated as is and without justification in a staggering number of scientific papers published at prestigious scientific journals such as IEEE Security and Privacy, IEEE Journal of Selected Areas in Communications, High Confidence Computing, Nature Communications, HCs, and SPML, among others. And I stress that these are only the papers that use the precise sentence in verbatim. Really, peer review in machine learning today is absolutely not a guarantee of quality. In fact, what's terrifying is that this scientific disinformation has already been used to justify all sorts of scientific federated learning systems in applications that go from predicting clinical cases of COVID-19 to detecting mental health problems, all based on highly sensitive information that, if known to family members or employers, could well disrupt the lives of people suffering from these diseases. And I emphasize that the cases I cite here are published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. In other words, the authors and the scientific journals are proud to have reproduced the information systems proposed by Google and to have applied them to the processing of personal data. Worse, by celebrating this work, which will then lead to grants and promotions for the authors at the expense of others, the culture and misinformation within the scientific community validates, encourages, and normalizes the hasty and ill-justified deployment of dangerous technologies and even the disregard for rigorous security. Most importantly, meanwhile, Google can quietly deploy even more sophisticated and far more memorization-capable algorithms based on users' data. And if or when they are sued for endangering users, they will be able to rightly answer that the guarantees of protection of sensitive information by the algorithms had been scientifically proven and validated by the scientific community, which has consistently asserted that federated learning is privacy preserving. This disinformation is terribly dangerous. And unfortunately, I can personally attest to the magnitude of the task of debunking this disinformation in the scientific community. I had the opportunity to be a reviewer recently at ICML and NeurIPS, the two most prestigious conferences in machine learning. And very disturbingly, every third paper in federated learning that I was asked to review was in turn propagating this disinformation. I had to take the time to debunk this disinformation, and I have to say that it is very troubling to have to debunk something so trivial to experts in the field. But more importantly, with 6 colleagues, including Mehdi and Hamdi, a researcher at Google, we wrote a paper that synthesizes the mathematical impossibility theorems on the security and privacy of a very sophisticated machine learning systems. Combining security and performance seems simply impossible. And thus, if we really value the security of billions of users and of ourselves, we must urgently sacrifice performance. Unfortunately, the reception of a research paper by Google on one hand and by the scientific community on the other hand, this reception has been complicated. To begin with, Google, whose approval was needed to add Mehdi's Google affiliation, put the paper on hold for several months before objecting to its submission. This is a priori unprecedented a year after Timid Gobru's dismissal, even though the outcome was predictable. In fact, we had anticipated Google's move and finally submitted the paper with Mehdi's other affiliation, as Mehdi also happens to be professor at the École Polytechnique in France. So that was Google's side. But on the other side, there was the peer review, which was even more disappointing. The main opposing reviewer justified the rejection of our paper precisely on the basis of the disinformation that the absence of recording of personal data was sufficient to guarantee the protection of personal data. And all of this in a very poorly written and hardly understandable message. This review is absolutely scandalous. The review also cites the majority use of Wikipedia, which is completely false, at least if we consider the most spectacular algorithms like GPT-3 or Palm that explicitly say that they rely much more on conversations on social medias, or if we consider the most influential algorithms like recommendation algorithms, Siri or smart keyboards, whose opacity allows companies to exploit ever more user data without any backlash. Now, the version of the paper we submitted back then was actually criticizable and criticized by other reviewers for other reasons. Nevertheless, the final decision to reject our paper will have clearly been influenced by the main critic, who at best propagated disinformation and at worst wanted to prevent the publication of scientific criticisms of deep learning security. From my experience, like many other people, some machine learning researchers hate to be asked to measure the actual social consequences of their work and of the work of their colleagues, and they sometimes abuse motivated reasoning to justify the ethics of their work paid by the taxpayer or by private companies, claiming that they are only doing theoretical work with no direct application, or that there exist some positive applications of their research, or that they are not responsible for the bad reuses of their publications. To defend the ethics of their works and to avoid questioning their careers, some academics are willing to turn a blind eye on the millions of lives that they contribute to endanger. Since then, our paper has been rewritten and resubmitted as a systematization of knowledge, that is to say, a meta-analysis, with a lot of added references and a lot more pedagogy to understand the scope of the published literature on machine learning security, which is still, in my view, far too difficult to publish in prestigious conferences and far too often ignored by machine learning researchers. Well, for the case of this paper, we'll see what the reviewers will say. And how they say it. Now, if there are privacy experts among you, you may be exclaiming that I still haven't mentioned the dominant concept in academic research on the protection of sensitive information, namely differential privacy. Well, the video is already very long, so I want to be able to take the time to really explain what it is. But basically, the idea of differential privacy is to send a noisy version of objects computed from personal data to Google servers. Evidently, this reduces Google's ability to recover the data. And indeed, if done well, this solution can be proved to partially protect personal data. But I really want to emphasize that differential privacy protects personal data, that is data that is explicitly associated to an individual, such as the data on the individual's phone or the data stored in the individual's Google account. But there is a crucial distinction to be made between personal data and sensitive information, i.e. information that someone does not want the algorithms to disseminate. This distinction is particularly important to be made in the case of language data, of web activities, or healthcare, because one's personal data always contains sensitive information about other people. Typically, my mother might have sent my address to my father. This sensitive information, that is my address, would then be in my parents' personal data, and it would thus not be protected in the way that differential privacy is intended to protect it. Similarly, my parents' genomic personal data inevitably betrays sensitive information about me, since my DNA is a combination of my parents' DNAs. In fact, a huge amount of sensitive information can be leaked in this way. To convince you of this, I invite you to watch this video or to read the story of the Golden State Killer who was betrayed by the personal data of distant cousins. As a result, the very concept of differential privacy is actually flawed for many high-stake applications. That being said, even assuming that differential privacy was an adequate concept, its practical implementation by industries is absolutely catastrophic, as discussed in this excellent paper. I won't go into details, but basically, the algorithms of tech giants are not at all sufficiently secure, even when they claim to guarantee differential privacy. And I'm not even talking about the unhealthy and dangerous reuse of the notion of differential privacy by tech giants, especially in terms of ethics washing, abuse of dominant position, and silencing other more serious problems. And yet, today, differential privacy is seen as the holy grail of protecting sensitive information by an overwhelming majority of the scientific community. So much so that an algorithm that is differentially private is often considered as privacy preserving. In 2021, a paper was accepted at ICLR, one of the 3 most prestigious conferences in machine learning alongside with ICML and NeurIPS, with the title Large Language Models Can Be Strongly Differentially Private Learners. Wow, what a misleading title. And once again, one of the authors of this scientific disinformation works at Google. Now, if we look at a charitable interpretation of the title, in a sense, okay, yes, these language models can be strongly differentially private learners in the sense that after being designed and trained in the first phase, they can then continue to learn in a second phase while respecting the privacy of the data exploited in the second phase. And this is what the paper does. Except that for one thing, the performance learned in the second phase is essentially trivial compared to what has been learned in the first phase. And moreover, and more importantly, the paper does not talk at all about protecting sensitive information in the first phase, which is the most critical phase because it requires a lot more data. Thus, the algorithm is far more likely to learn sensitive information in this first phase. More importantly still, the title can easily give the impression that large language models can guarantee differential privacy in general while having excellent performances. This is likely to be the misinformation that will be spread to the scientific community exposed to the paper, as most scientists only read the title and the abstract, do not take the time to read the content of the paper, and most importantly, trust the authors and the peer review system. To publish a paper that will clearly suggest that deep learning can easily protect sensitive information without loss of performance is, I think, serious, dangerous, scientific disinformation. A disinformation without any fake news, because technically you can always justify the title of the paper, but it seems to be disinformation nonetheless, i.e. an intentional way of harming the propagation of quality information. In this case, it amplifies the false belief that privacy problems in machine learning can easily be solved or mitigated, which I think is very similar to a polluting oil industry whose communications may reinforce the belief that they can compensate their carbon emissions by planting trees. This form of disinformation is, I think, very dangerous. So let me clarify this again. No, very large machine learning models cannot achieve their performances while protecting sensitive information, at least given today's algorithms. Worse, many theoretical works suggest, on the contrary, the impossibility of such a protection of sensitive information without major performance degradation, as we discuss in our paper. The race for performance, in which we are completely engaged because of the repeated press releases of DALL-E and Lambda, which are too often massively relayed by medias and by social network users, this race for performance will inevitably greatly harm privacy. Machine learning algorithms are therefore a serious threat to the protection of sensitive information, and yet this threat seems almost paltry compared to what I am really concerned about. What terrifies me the most is that algorithms amplify, encourage, and normalize disinformation, cyberbullying, and hate speech, as we have seen in China, India, Ethiopia, in the United Kingdom, in Brazil, or in the United States. The disinformation and hatred can lead to dangerous policies, deadly riots, and even to the genocides of entire populations. After the United Nations, Amnesty International has recognized the criminal role of Facebook in the amplification of hatred in Myanmar against the Rohingya community, and they are asking for reparations. The Rohingyas have initiated legal procedures and are asking for $150 billion in compensation, which with the decline of Facebook now represents almost half of the value of the company. But why do learning algorithms promote disinformation and hate in this way? Are these algorithms inherently malicious? Do their designers seek to propagate disinformation and hate? Well, no, probably not. At least not intentionally, although they clearly see that this increases their revenues and their bonuses. The problem is mostly that modern learning algorithms are generally designed to learn and to generalize from the data they learn from. If their data contains disinformation, bullying, and hate, then these algorithms will repeat, generalize, and amplify disinformation, bullying, and hate. As discussed in a previous video, data is manipulating learning algorithms. Okay, but wouldn't it be possible to protect against malicious accounts that produce and amplify disinformation? Well, in 2021, a positive answer is provided by 4 researchers, one of whom works at Google. Yes, you're getting it. This paper, accepted by academic peers in the prestigious Economics and Computing Conference, is once again, I think, a dangerous disinformation. In the last sentence of its abstract, this paper states, I'm quoting, "Our results indicate that online platforms can effectively combat fraudulent users without incurring large costs by designing new learning algorithms that guarantee efficient convergence even when the platform is completely oblivious to the number and identity of the fake users." The analogy with oil companies claiming that climate change can be effectively combated with new technologies is so striking that I really have a hard time not seeing malice in this sentence. And again, you only have to dive into the paper to realize that this sentence is actually only valid under completely unrealistic assumptions. But to realize this, given how the title and abstract are written, it is unfortunately necessary to actually dive into the paper and to take the time to analyze the theorems, which clearly also requires some mathematical fluency. But once this work is done, one realizes that this assertion is only valid if the number of fake accounts is exponentially smaller than the number of genuine accounts. Exponentially smaller. In other words, if there are 30 fake accounts, then you can fight these fake accounts at low cost with new algorithms, only if your platform has, say, 2 to the 30 genuine accounts, which corresponds to 1 billion human users. And if the attackers create 3 more fake accounts, you will need more real accounts than there are humans on Earth. But of course, the assumption that Google would only have 33 fake accounts is itself completely unrealistic. Remember the statistics. Every year, Facebook removes around 7 billion fake accounts. In this context, not only is the main claim of the paper completely misleading, but the paper as a whole is itself completely useless. And yet, the paper was accepted at the Economics and Computing Conference, the same conference that rejected one of our papers in 2022 despite an enthusiastic reviewer, merely because the other reviewer judged that the topic that we tackled, I'm quoting, despite claims of machine learning connections, does not seem significant. This allows me to point out that acceptance to scientific publication is much more related to the attractiveness, if not to sensationalism, than what one might think. And in particular, it is not at all completely objective, neutral, or impartial. In fact, this makes the peer review process itself very vulnerable to disinformation attacks, especially given that many reviewers are Google employees or Google-funded researchers. In the same year, with colleagues including the excellent Sadek Farhad Khani, we got a paper accepted at NeurIPS, a top venue in machine learning. On the contrary, our paper demonstrates the mathematical impossibility of effectively defending against fake accounts indistinguishable from real ones, especially when there is a lot of heterogeneity among the genuine accounts. Although not written with this goal in mind, our article debunks the misinformation cited above. But unfortunately, at the moment, our debunking has fewer scientific citations, namely 8, than Google's disinformation, which has 14 citations. The scientific community is propagating much more the completely misleading claim that resilience to fake accounts can be easily addressed by new algorithms than the much more solid arguments on the vulnerability of large-scale algorithms. Again, the stakes are high since it allows Google to claim that they have full control over their technologies, much like the private company in the Don't Look Up movie, which claims that it can mine and divert the asteroid all by itself. Moreover, with this article accepted by the scientific community, Google can tell the legislators that audits and cybersecurity regulations are superfluous or even counterproductive for civil society, since it is scientifically established that they only need to develop new algorithms as only they know how. And yet, meanwhile, the need and ability to influence recommendation algorithms seems to have become obvious for many of you who follow me, as I have seen in my own comments. But if you guys know that you can influence the algorithms, we must expect that powerful and malicious entities, such as authoritarian governments and multinationals with profits to protect, will also exploit this machine learning feature to bias the information that most users will be most exposed to. But since such malicious entities have much more fundings and clout to do so than those who advocate for quality information, we should expect that machine learning algorithms will be much more influenced by disinformation than by quality information. And indeed, this is what research, journalism, and leaks from tech giants keep showing. Unfortunately, papers that consider the possibility of algorithm manipulation are still incredibly rare in machine learning conferences. What is terrifying to me is that almost all machine learning research makes the dangerously questionable assumption that learning algorithms should aim to learn and generalize all the data they have access to. And this is often accompanied with the famous IID assumption, which is what most of the theory of machine learning relies on, and which assumes that all of the data is drawn independently from a mysterious true law of probability that must be absolutely learned. This is kind of the invisible hand of the theory of machine learning. And well, okay, this assumption makes some pretty mathematics and it allows researchers to shine by their mathematical ingenuity, but in the end it's very much like making the hypothesis of efficient markets and applying it to markets like the information market, the electricity market, or the natural resource markets. Okay, the researcher can stand out then because of their technical virtuosity, and this will help them win prizes, get their dream jobs, and sometimes makes millions if they flirt with Google in particular. But in doing so, the scholar is also propagating misinformation and misunderstandings, as well as habits that are extremely dangerous for human societies. In the current geopolitical context, I strongly believe that academia urgently needs to stop valuing those who are smart, productive, or impressive, and should value a lot more those whose academic outputs actually contribute to make the world a safer place for all. Now, this problem of security is actually even worse in the case of federated learning, since participants in the system can more easily send anything to Google servers. These servers will have a harder time to determine whether the gradients come from some plausible data or not. Moreover, these participants can more easily optimize their attacks to further bias the algorithms that everyone else uses in their preferred directions. As a result, the overwhelming majority of federated learning algorithms published in the scientific literature is in fact extremely vulnerable to so-called Byzantine attacks and thus very dangerous to deploy at scale. Since 2017, to finally consider the security of federated learning during training, and Mahdi M. Hamdi, back then a PhD student at EPFL, as well as his colleagues in particular Peva Blanchard and Julien Steiner, they invented the concept of Byzantine resilient learning with a publication at NeurIPS. A long series of papers followed, some of which I was involved with, published at top conferences like ICML, ICLR, and MLCs to better understand how to secure federated learning, but also to identify the theoretical limits to securing such systems. And back in 2018, Mahdi already motivated his work with the fear of the rise of anti-vax movements and extremism via recommendation algorithms. And in fact, this shouldn't surprise those of you who have read our book Le Fabuleux Chantier, so far only in French, which we started to write in 2018, and which considers that making recommendation algorithms robustly beneficial is the most urgent and the most fabulous endeavor that humanity should undertake. However, to our frustration, despite the information chaos of COVID, the Capitol riots, and the war in Ukraine, the machine learning science community still struggles to prioritize security problems. And Google is not beyond blame for this. Clearly, the research exposing the security flaws of federated learning is very embarrassing for companies like Google, which surely show in it the future of targeted advertising. And this is probably what motivated them to encourage and fund research that is clearly aimed at denigrating security research. And to my great disappointment, the resulting disinformation paper, which is co-authored by a Google researcher, has been accepted by the scientific community in the IEEE Security and Privacy Conference. Let me quote from the paper's abstract. We present a critical analysis of untargeted poisoning attacks under practical production federated learning environments by carefully characterizing the set of realistic threat models and adversarial capabilities. Our findings are rather surprising. Contrary to the established belief, we show that federated learning is highly robust in practice, even when using simple, low-cost defenses. Given the many misleading formulations in these sentences, there is essentially no doubt in my mind that this is intentional disinformation. In short, the most important point to remember to debunk this disinformation is that the practical production environment considered by the article is absolutely not the practical production environment of algorithms deployed on a very large scale and with major geopolitical stakes. Indeed, the paper exclusively studies image classification for two standard datasets, namely NIST and C410. For these datasets, the goal is typically recognizing that this is a tree or that this is a truck, which is really not what today's most influential algorithms are all about. In fact, these tasks are extremely easy, especially compared to what is required of language or recommendation algorithms. But then, robustness in these simple cases actually says almost nothing about the robustness in the real cases of much more complex applications. In particular, it seems to me to be a dangerous and intentional lie to claim that the paper in question corresponds to the practical and production environment. To illustrate, it is as if in order to validate an autonomous car, one would test it in a closed circuit and claim, contrary to the established belief, we show that the autonomous car is highly robust in practice even using simple low-cost algorithms. Asserting this for applications as dangerous as algorithms used on large scale and therefore far more dangerous than autonomous cars since they already put millions of lives in danger in India, Brazil or Ethiopia, this seems absolutely criminal to me. More generally, contrary to what this paper does, security must never be validated by examples where everything goes well, especially when these examples are not at all representative of the huge diversity of applications and of attacks that the systems we want to secure will encounter in actual practice. Security requires guarantees against all sorts of attacks, including those that we have not yet had the intelligence to think of. And this is best done through mathematical theorems. Asserting robustness without mathematical guarantees, or at least extensive highly adversarial stress testing, is at best dangerously misleading, and at worst, especially when it comes to large-scale algorithms which endanger large populations, this is, I think, criminal. And yeah, okay, Google is a multinational corporation and we must expect them to reuse the disinformation methods previously used by Total or Philip Morris. What disappoints me the most in this story is actually not Google, but rather the scientific community, which is not only scientifically validating this misinformation in prestigious scientific journals, but often goes so far as to celebrate it by inviting the authors of such papers to speak at universities, thereby giving them more voice to spread their disinformation. I wish researchers were far more suspicious of the Google colleagues they invite and much more willing to ask them tough questions, such as about the transparency, security, and ethics of the algorithms that their employers develop, or even about the questionable origins of their own salaries. This time, given the seriousness of these claims, with my colleagues Sadek Faradkhani and Oscar Villemot among others, we took the time and effort to debunk this article and all the misinformation about the security of federated learning in a paper that was recently accepted at ICML, one of the top conferences in machine learning. And I'm saying this as though it was easy to publish at ICML, but it is really a monumental work to do, which can be a dream for some academics or even some companies. Basically, the Google paper claimed that data injection attacks are benign, while Byzantine attacks are unrealistic. Our paper debunks these claims by showing that in the prevailing theoretical frameworks of personalized federated learning, these two attacks are in fact equivalent. If one is benign, then the other must necessarily be benign. But of course, if one is harmful, then the other must be considered harmful as well. Our paper then exploits this equivalence to design devastating data injection attacks against insecure federated learning, including in simplistic cases such as NIST image classification. More importantly, by proving equivalence, our paper imports theorems from the Byzantine resilience literature to the case of resilience to malicious data injection. In particular, we prove the impossibility of securing any federated learning system in the case where there is strong heterogeneity in the behavior of genuine users, which is clearly the more realistic assumption. Unfortunately, once again, Google's disinformation has many more citations than our papers, in this case 26 times more since our paper has only been cited once. Now, it's just the beginning and I wish I could tell you that this is going to change, but I'm not that optimistic. This being said, as we point out in the literature review paper, all the work that has been done on the security of machine learning for the last 6 years should be taken with a grain of salt, especially when it comes to the positive security theorems. Indeed, these positive security theorems are themselves based on unrealistic or unjustified assumptions, such as the assumption that the data of most users should be generalized. Now, of course, there are applications where generalizing the data is justifiable, such as when applying machine learning to physics or chemistry. However, this assumption has become so common and so widespread that scientists often no longer expect their colleagues to justify it. But as a result, the domain of applicability of published work is often unclear or unexplained in a huge proportion of academic research. Yet, in the most influential, lucrative, and dangerous practical applications of machine learning, such as ad targeting and content recommendation, generalizing the data often amounts to normalizing the status quo, amplifying addictions, and making disinformation triumph, all of which is arguably terribly dangerous for human societies. And the problem is actually not limited to fake accounts. even assuming no fake accounts at all, which is completely unrealistic, but let's be charitable for a second. The behavior of many genuine accounts can be very undesirable to learn and to generalize, as we saw for the case of tweets. This AI, produced by Microsoft, learned from probably authentic troll accounts, and then generalized their views, which turned it into a sexist, racist, and genocidal monster. Misinformation, harassment, and hate are in fact massively produced or at least shared by a huge fraction, perhaps even by the majority of genuine accounts, especially on platforms like Twitter or Reddit. Any algorithm that learns from this data, even with the state-of-the-art secure algorithms proposed in the scientific literature today, will be bound to repeat and massively amplify many behaviors that are not only abhorrent, but could also, and most importantly, exacerbate democratic decline on a global scale and increase the risks of global war. It is urgent that the entire machine learning community really measures the extent of the responsibility that the impact of their work implies and the dangerous consequences of their silence. Since Google is using our papers to design algorithms on a global scale, we are no longer researchers whose basic science is disconnected from the real world. Our choices of research topics and working hypotheses, but also our decisions about which collaborations to establish, which speakers to invite, and which colleagues to recruit, all of this is now tilting the balance in the ongoing information war over the security of the modern world's most influential algorithms and over the urgency to heavily invest in their audits. Every time we make the assumption that we should minimize a loss function that seeks to fit the data, especially without pointing out the consequences of invoking these assumptions on the inapplicability of our work, especially for the most influential algorithms, we celebrate and normalize data learning and generalization, and we contribute to omitting and ignoring the widely exposed problems like the problem of the algorithmic amplification of cyberbullying. Every time we fail to question such assumptions in publications and in presentations made by others, we normalize and facilitate the deployment of algorithms that massively and dangerously learn, generalize, and amplify misinformation and hate speech. Every time we relay images produced by Facebook's algorithms, text produced by GPT-3, or biological advances by Google DeepMind, we amplify free advertising for the spectacularity of machine learning, and most importantly, we make the safety and ethics of algorithms more and more of a mute news, i.e. a topic that hardly anyone talks about or thinks of. Additionally, we normalize the lack of democratic control over the algorithms that most control the flow of information and disinformation around the world. If you think there is nothing wrong about celebrating the spectacular advances of machine learning, it is certainly because you have never tried to actively promote the security and ethics of machine learning, and thus have never realized how much inattention or even contempt there is for these far more important topics. Celebrating the spectacularity of machine learning in the current context is a bit like celebrating the ingenuity of the spectacular constructions of air-conditioned stadiums in the middle of the desert. It is prioritizing technological progress and the comfort of the machine learning researcher's job at the expense of the exposed and dramatic sufferings of millions of humans. I hope I have convinced you that giants like Google are indeed engaged in scientific disinformation and that this is extremely dangerous, especially in the context of the cyber and information warfare of the modern world. And unfortunately, the scientific community is currently buying, amplifying, and normalizing Google's disinformation. Too often in academia, it is regarded as cool to work for or with Google. But more importantly, the few who actually take the time to identify the disinformation and to deconstruct it are undervalued, underfunded, and even ignored. This seems to guarantee Google's disinformation and dystopian triumph in an information war in which all computer scientists are involved, whether they like it or not, if only because they demand attention, collaborators, and funding, potentially at the expense of those who are really fighting disinformation. Typically, many of the resources I had at my disposal, including top-notch collaborators, have arguably been stolen by other academics who are now using them for work that seems so much less useful and sometimes even harmful to society. Yes, because to debunk Google's work as I did, especially at the level of the scientific community and scientific publications, it takes a lot of time, a lot of expertise, and a lot of sacrifices. I know that I've made myself highly influential enemies in companies that have fully engaged in disinformation and that have actually fired their ethics teams. I even fear that even universities and researchers who may have typically a strong partnership with Google will now refuse to partner with me in the future. Having said this, I actually have other projects, including launching a startup to provide real security solutions and to train data science teams in machine learning security, typically to avoid, huge data leaks through machine learning algorithms. But the problem is often more tricky for my indispensable collaborators, usually much younger and less established, who are looking for internships, fellowships, and career opportunities. In fact, even I sometimes advise young people to do what's needed to publish, like motivating machine learning by hypothetical health applications, even though it will be much more likely used for ad targeting, or motivating research on algorithm acceleration by energy consumption reduction, even though there will often clearly be an unavoidable rebound effect. And above all, it will make ethics and security once again a secondary topic, or even a mutinous within the scientific community. Unfortunately, the academic world, governed by prestige and metrics like H-index, often comes to ignore the societal impact of scholars' work and to kill the careers of those who do not do what's needed to publish. Publish or perish, as we often say. But as a result, the survivors, those who govern academic research by deciding on recruitment and funding, they will more often than not be those who did more to publish, including surfing on the trends initiated by Google with lucrative or diversionary objectives, even if it requires ignoring subjects that are more difficult to publish and less cited by our peers, such as security and ethics. Worse, these established scientists too often still have the nagging prejudice that a good scientist should only have a say about science which is neutral and unbiased, even though making the high idea assumption and assuming that data should be generalized is in fact absolutely not neutral or unbiased and even less responsible or scientifically correct. In any case, as sad as it may seem, the academic world is now in a state that the disinformation of Google, but also of Facebook or OpenAI, has undoubtedly sought and clearly succeeded in obtaining. Like algorithms, as long as funding and promotions in academia do not seriously take into account the social impact, science will be hacked and will have the voice of those who have the most means to write scientific-looking articles. As a result, we must fear the fact that the predominant theory of machine learning will be the one that suits Google, namely one that does not assume dangerousness in the generalization and amplification of data, or that provides security guarantees only under unrealistic assumptions or in unrepresentative experiments. Now, debunking is important, but building really secure solutions, especially for the solidity of democracies and world peace, is of course much better. Ideally, I'd like to spend all of my time on that rather than on reading the lies that Google writes and then explaining to the scientific community and the general public the danger that their disinformation represents. But since hardly anyone is doing the debunking work, and because it is still important that it is being done, I'm doing it. But of course, what motivates me, what excites me the most, is rather building solutions to govern algorithms collaboratively and securely. In particular, I would like to develop technical solutions to ensure as much as possible that these algorithms do what we really want them to do and not what uncontrolled web data pushes them to do. And after now 6 years of reading and thinking about this particular topic, and 12 years of thinking more globally about collaborative governance, I have come to the conclusion that a participatory project like Tournesol is by far the most promising project to fight disinformation and hate and to value quality information as it should be. Instead of making the high idea assumption and trying to fit all of the data, Tournesol assumes that each user has their own preferences, not only on the recommendation they will receive, but also and especially on the recommendations that other users will be receiving. Don't forget that what's recommended to millions of people in Russia affects the security of 40 million Ukrainians. Tournesol then uses the state-of-the-art in secure machine learning that we have been developing over the last 6 years, and in particular an algorithm called Mehestan, to aggregate in a fair and secure way the judgments of our different contributors. This project has raised many research challenges ranging from the development of new algorithms and the mathematical proof of their security, to the empirical analysis of the collected data, and to the study of the social impact of Tournesol on the consumption habits of the users, a study that we are still in the process of setting up and which, if all goes well, should be carried out soon. But to do more, and we absolutely need to do more, Tournesol would urgently need a lot more than the donations of a few people to pay our only employee who is responsible for web development. Unfortunately, so far, our 6 grant proposals have all been rejected by various entities, all of which seem to severely underestimate the monumental impact of recommendation algorithms and the importance of designing a solution to govern them collaboratively and securely. Under such conditions, it is impossible to fight Google. One of the main goals of Tournesol is to bring the problem of collaborative and secure governance of algorithms to the attention of the scientific community by clearly identifying concrete problems whose resolutions would have real beneficial impacts. So, if you have friends in academia, send them this video and engage them in a discussion about the disinformation their community suffers from, and ask them if they have ever really thought of the security and ethics of today's most influential algorithms. And if they are looking for ethical research topics, well, you can mention Tournesol. In particular, Tournesol invites any academic and anyone to download the public dataset of contributors' judgments. This dataset now contains almost 50,000 comparisons, which makes it comparable to NIST or CIFAR-10, which we mentioned earlier. But it would be really nice to exceed the symbolic 100,000 comparisons mark, and even more convincing if we could have more than 1 million comparisons. We argue that this dataset is a lot more interesting than NIST or CIFAR-10, since they are human judgments about what the most influential algorithms in the modern world should do. Moreover, the structure of this data is much more similar to the structure of the data collected by the web giants, i.e. data associated to users, and as a result, they naturally raise privacy and security issues. Finally, these judgments correspond to annotations of quality YouTube videos, which are much more interesting objects of study than NIST or CIFAR-10 images. In particular, we can then hope to understand and generalize the notion of video quality according to human judgments, which is a generalization that seems much more desirable to do than the generalization of social network users' behaviors. But in order to be heard by the scientific community, to divert their attentions away from Google's scientific disinformation and all the opportunities that follow from befriending them, and to direct their research towards the problem of ethics and information security that requires so much of their expertise, attention, and work, we will have to give credibility and value to Tournesol's public dataset. And this depends on you. You can greatly help to improve the quality of scientific research in artificial intelligence simply by creating an account on Tournesol and by comparing the recommendability of different YouTube videos that you have watched. You can also contribute to our dataset by vouching for your friends and by asking them to vouch for you, which, by the way, will also increase your voting rights. Finally, you can relay the calls you contribute to Tournesol and, for instance, ask your favorite science popularizers, journalists, and influencers to talk more about Tournesol or to share the Tournesol links of their videos rather than the YouTube links, at least once their videos have received very high scores. The research on machine learning ethics and security is being hacked, denigrated, and ignored. It needs your help to flourish and to finally contribute to protecting human societies from the dangers of misinformation, harassment, and hate.